Welcome back, everyone. We have another special guest today. It's Tanay Patri. Hello, Tanay.
Hey.
So Tanay has done a lot of different kinds of debate, mostly parley in university. So did American parliamentary debate, was ninth speaker of the year in his senior year, won a handful of different APDA tournaments. In British parliamentary debate, broke at Worlds, and has since then become a very avid CA or chief adjudicator at lots of major tournaments like the US University Debate Championship, the upcoming North American Universities Debate Championship, and also judged some major rounds at major tournaments. For example, the ESL finals at Worlds recently as well. So very happy to have you on today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to get to talk with you.
So other than you absolutely destroying me and Roy in quarters of NYU, I feel like I don't know that much about your like debate journey. Can you tell us how did you start debating originally?
Yeah, so I actually started in high school doing PF. And so most of my high school debate was local circuit, public forum. I went to high school in Tennessee, and so we would debate in the Atlanta circuit, the Birmingham circuits, kind of the basically those local circuits, and we'd do some major tournaments. Occasionally, I think we went to Blue Key and we did some stuff at Emory at Barclay Forum. So we would go to those kind of major tournaments, and that was really my exposure. We weren't super resourced as a team, like we didn't have a lot of like institutional knowledge, so we were probably doing PF a little bit wrong. And in retrospect, I actually think it was pretty funny because if I look back at like the things and the way that I used to think about debate then, I just feel like it's evolved so much. And I would love to like impart some of my wisdom back to myself, be like, why are you doing this? Like, what are you thinking? In terms of some of the ways that I used to think about it. So that's where I started. I went to Northeastern and so did Parley, both American Parley and British Parley. And really enjoyed it. And I think even there was like a lot of transformation. So my freshman year and sophomore year, I think I really focused on like hyper technical topic areas. So like I would do a lot of case work and case construction and like finance and econ. And that is what I studied. So I guess that makes a fair bit of sense. And so that would really be like what I would do. But then I realized that like there's such an opportunity to make way more interesting arguments and talk about so many more interesting things. And I really experimented a lot my junior and senior year with different types of strategies. So, moving away from like more general, like very hyper tech topics to super creative things, very pop culture, sports, stuff like that. And also just like playing around with the dynamics of a round. So like using less prep, less speech time, and like thinking about how that impacts debate as well. So definitely veered much more creative once I got familiar with it. And it ended up paying dividends for me. I don't know if all of those are strategies I would recommend for everyone every round, but I think there's definitely room for creativity and experimentation.
100%. This is one of the themes that's been consistent in all of these interviews is like people have been telling me like, sometimes you gotta go and just experiment and lose a bunch experimenting. I think that this is something that PFers need to learn more, especially now. Like you're so right. Things have changed so much. Not only like, I don't know, we've learned more as we've become better
Yeah.
debaters. I just like watched, oh my gosh, like right before our call, I was watching a PF round they just got released on like a YouTube channel. It's like it's so different. And I think it's almost becoming more standardized, if that makes sense, on the national circuit. Which I think is a bit of a shame. Like people are clearly not really experimenting with the intention of like trying to do different things that no one else has thought of before. Which does, as you point out, pay a lot of dividends. So there's a lot to unpack from what you just said. I think one good starting point is you mentioned that you have a lot of advice that you would give your past self, doing like local circuit PF. What are some of the like highlights of that advice that you would give your past self?
Yeah. And I will take this with a grain of salt. Like I'm not like fully as deep in the PF world as I once was.
I think that's a
And
good
yeah,
thing.
my exposure to PF currently is like the once a year that I judge the Harvard tournament usually. And like maybe someone will ask you a PF question one time a year. Um, so I think the biggest thing I would tell myself is it's so easy when doing case construction, to really just get tunnel vision. I think that the way that cases are written now is it's like you're trying to prove like two things that are true or three things that are true, for a resolution, and there is zero comparison. Like PF cases, and I understand that like time constraints are a real thing, but there is just no comparison at all. I think if teams paired back on arguments and were just like, here is like the general thrust of the argument, here is like proving that it happens, and then spend way more time comparing like your impacts to the other team, that would serve people so much better, even from your first constructive. And that's the number one thing, because I think that it's just like cases have now become this like brute force tool of like how can I like fit 40 pieces of evidence into like my 4 minutes or 3 minutes and like just make sure that I can get as much as possible. And I just don't know that that's like the best way to think about it.
No, 100%. So, how would you go about like even putting that comparison in like first constructive or just in general earlier in the round?
Yeah. So I actually think that this topic, the nuclear energy topic, is perfect, right, for doing this because obviously, like the side supporting more nuclear energy investment is going to talk about why nuclear energy is great, why it is, clean, why there's less of a footprint, right? All those are fine. But the important thing within the round is what is nuclear energy replacing, right? Is it replacing coal, which is hyper efficient, but also very entrenched in communities? Or is it replacing like solar and wind, which are roughly, equally environmentally friendly in some regards, but also like much more land intensive? And the people who get pissed off if you replace one or the other are very
Mm.
different. And
Right.
so I think teams have to do work up front of like, if you increase nuclear investment, like this is what gets crowded out first, and this is where it's going to happen, and you have to prove that first, and then you can actually enter all the arguments about how good it actually is.
Right,
And I think that that's
100%.
a layer of the debate too.
Yeah, it's almost like a gateway. Like I feel like you have to
Yeah,
pass this threshold to even enter the debate in the first place. Because if you don't know what you're comparing nuclear energy against, like what is it replacing, then like
yeah,
none of your arguments are coherent at all. Like,
yeah,
okay, it's clean, cleaner than what, right?
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, I think this is certainly good advice. And I think the way that you're describing it as well, like I'm remembering some advice that I was told. I don't remember who told me this. Probably like one of the people slightly older than me on the Brown team. But one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got in APDA for how to build cases and start to actually build like constructive arguments is to think about like list out in your head like all of the actors, all of the relevant stakeholders in the debate and like all of the possible reactions they would have. Maybe a good way to think about this is like incentive and capacity. Like, how does the topic interact with each of their interests, and what power do they have to do something about that? Like, how would they likely react to the passage of the resolution? I think that's one dimension that you're teasing out here that I feel like hasn't really been covered in a lot of the other interviews, and in general is not really a thing in PF. Like, we don't really blink twice about anything to do with like actors and stakeholders and how they react. The closest we get is like maybe a politics DA, like oh
Yeah,
this
yeah,
takes up your political capital or something.
yeah,
But I think it is like that's where probably some of the most creative arguments can come into play. Is like I don't know how do like lobbying groups react when wind energy expands or something.
yeah.
Okay, the like path of questions I wanted to ask you earlier is you said that you've played a lot with more creative strategies as you became more experienced in debate and branched out a bit. What are some examples of that, and like what kinds of different ways did you view debates when you started becoming more experienced?
Yeah. I think the most impactful one, and I think probably the one that like I gained the most notoriety for better or for worse, was MCs. So the first speech in an APTA round, and I'll just provide a little context in case people aren't that familiar with it, but it's usually 7 minutes and 30 seconds. And the way the general meta of APTA has kind of evolved is like use that time for the leader of opposition to like figure out what they want to respond to, and it helps them create their speech. But I realized that I could raise the bar on what the leader of opposition is required to do if I just give a 90-second speech and I force them to plant their flag somewhere. And so then all of a sudden they can't just like lean on my speech to like build their own, but they're forced to then plant a flag somewhere and give independent arguments. And as someone who has already thought through like where I want the round to go, I'm just taking away the most valuable resource from them, which is time. And honestly, an analog for this is like prep and PF. And I don't know if the meta has changed, but I kind of think like if you have a clear vision, don't just burn your prep because the other team is also using your prep.
Yeah, yeah.
So like it's kind of like a similar kind of thought process. And it honestly led to some crazy results, right? Where people would just like not know what to say, like very, very good debaters. I'm like, I did this once against the team that ended up winning Team of the Year in 2020 and they just imploded. Like it was truly like they didn't really know where to go. They kind of like made a couple of vague arguments, but like nothing was truly proven because they didn't want to really commit. And the second speech on the government side just like cleaned out the entire speech, gave like much like put them on the back foot and forced them to be really defensive. And by the end of the round, I mean, they were very good debaters, so they had some good defense that they were able to provide, but they had literally nothing you could vote for them on. So all we had to do was beat one piece of defense and the round was over just due to like a tactical decision. And I think that those kinds of things are like it's a little bit gamey for sure. And I think that there are obviously ways to like deal with it, but I think that it is interesting to see what you can do. And sometimes it is about like strategizing a little bit smarter in certain cases rather than harder.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I heard there was a team in APDA semi recently who wrote a case that was like, um, I think it was something like Gov shouldn't give a PMC. It was like it was something meta like that. And then of course
Yeah,
they
yeah,
like
yeah.
didn't give a PMC during the case. So to be clear, you're like basically sacrificing your own first constructive in order to deprive the op of time. I guess this probably doesn't work as well in PF since it's not
Yes,
really
for
like
sure.
a limited prep event.
Right, right, right.
Um, Most likely both sides have a fairly similar vision of how they want the round to go, unless one
Yeah.
side has like tragically under prepped or something.
Yeah, it's definitely not a tactic that at all works in PF for the most part. What I do think it is useful for is you can start to like you can your arguments that you commit to early in the round don't have to be the same ones that you collapse on in the same form. And what I mean by that is like you can prove a lot of things and the endpoint can be like multifocal, right? Like you can prove like it may help prove two or three things. And a lot of times what I've seen in PF is I think it's largely due to like a lack of experience, but it's that people will focus on like the one big piece, right? They'll be like, here's like why you don't reach that one big endpoint. And that doesn't mean that the argument's dead. It just means that you can
Yeah.
reroute go for other endpoints. And that I think is like part of how that creativity can manifest in PF.
Yeah, dude, 100%. I feel like PFers think of arguments as like I don't know where the analogy is going. Stay with me here.
Yeah.
It might be
Yeah.
this is like half baked. It's like a plant that's growing out of the ground and like it's got like a flower at the top. And PFers view that as just like it has like a singular stem and then it has one flower at the top. And that's your like big juicy impact at the end. These days it's all like extinction or whatever. But I think the better way to view it is like actually no, there are like lots of different branch points that are coming off of this plant. And so
Yeah.
even if you like, I don't know, you like cut off the flower at the top, the plant's not dead. You've got like all these other different ways that other parts of the link chain can affect the round. I
For
think a
sure.
good example is like actually the climate change argument on nuclear energy. One of the premises of the argument is that nuclear energy will replace like coal and natural gas, and that these things are dirty. That's like an inherent part of the argument that happens before you get to the eventual like everyone dies because of climate change.
Yeah.
Even if you lose the climate change debate entirely, you can go for like coal is bad as like a part of the argument before you get to climate change, and then like weigh that. Like for example,
Yeah.
like I don't know, they've got like a nuclear waste argument on the neg, and you're like, you know what else is waste? Coal. Like that's even worse waste.
Yeah. There's also just like and I think kind of to your point, right? a lot of times I notice that PFers go for like impact evaluation and absolutes. So it's like extinction or nothing. And it's like, well, okay, maybe, but like pollution is pretty bad and like leads to harms that like lead to impacting people's health, or like, not focusing on climate change has other impacts other than extinction, and just proving like people accept such high burdens with these arguments that sometimes it would just be smart to like pare back like the actual burden you want to accept and go for like a more realistic impact, even if it's smaller. And I think that's part of it. Like, and I don't know what the judging pool looks like for PF these days, if it's getting more lay or more tech, but I can't imagine that like a parent is like sitting there being like, climate change is going to lead to extinction, versus like climate change might lead to like an increased risk of like lung disease. Like I feel like one of those is far more plausible for like the average like parent of a 15-year-old who's like judging this around.
Yeah,
So
I think there's like two really important takeaways from this comment specifically. One is like obviously you should adapt your cases to the judge. Like
yeah,
this,
for
this
sure.
should this should be a given. You shouldn't be running like I don't know, nuclear energy is going to lead to like global nuclear proliferation, miscalculation, nuke
Yeah,
terrorism in front of like my mom. That would
yeah,
probably be a recipe for disaster.
yeah,
But the second takeaway I think is maybe even more interesting is that in technical rounds too, like with the most technical judge that you have, I think it is worth it to think about the arguments as all being scales. And by that I mean like you don't get extinction or not, like you said, but extinction is still an argument you can make. It's just
sure.
not like guaranteed. It's like you would call it high burden, but also I think one way of looking at that is just like you have some percent chance difference between the two worlds of extinction.
For
Like
sure.
maybe you
100%.
tip the scales like 0.001%, and that could be significant. But I think it's worth admitting that. Like these arguments are not all or nothing. And if you understand that, it unlocks like a whole new world of possibilities in debate. For example, I think the climate change argument, again, on this topic, is a wonderful example because every argument that people make against it these days is like the most I don't want to like it's just not a good response in my opinion. Like people will say climate change is inevitable. There are other countries that will still pollute. We still have cars. Empirically, when countries introduce nuclear energy, like their emissions still go up. And like all of these things are true, probably. I think it's much easier to just admit that those things are true. Like, yes, this is a big global problem. We're not going to solve it overnight by like making new nuclear reactors. But you still have a very sizable argument that probably still outweighs the vast majority of what they have going for them. If you just admit that, like, it is, I guess, technically marginal in like the definitional sense of the word. Like, you
Yeah,
are operating on a margin of the impact, but it is still such a sizable impact that you still can control, like, compared to them, like a pretty significant probability of extinction. Significant again in relative terms, not
yeah,
in
for
these like absolute terms that we're pretending that we're using. But I think that like that blew my mind when I made that revelation, and it really changes how you debate. I guess there's one problem. I want your advice on how to overcome this problem. The problem these days, this is what I was talking about with Roy and Ale the other day, is that judges have seemed to just come to accept this kind of stuff. Like you were, predicting maybe the pool has gotten more lay or more tech. I think it's kind of neither. It's gotten more polarized. And so
sure.
the technical judges have become more, I don't even want to use the word technical, but they've started drinking the Kool-Aid more. You get the same effect that we've had in a lot of other events where the first year outs come back and they judge, and then that means that the strategy that they used becomes more like, on the more and more radical strategies continue winning and winning and winning. Um, and I think the effect of that has largely become that the technical rounds and the national circuit, everyone sort of is willing to uh, look the other way when an argument is operating as a one or a zero. And if everyone is pretending that together, like I guess there's a strategic benefit of also joining in and pretending that. Um, and there might be a strategic harm. I guess this is the fear of probably a lot of the viewers, is like there might be a strategic loss when you point out, you reveal that all of this is kind of bullshit. Um, at what cost? I don't know. Do you have
Yeah.
anything to say about that?
So, yeah, I guess I have two thoughts. One is that is entirely unsurprising. As like the way that national circuit has probably evolved. Like that to me does not shock me one bit. Um, I think there's a couple of things. From a judging perspective, and maybe tournaments and the circuit, if this is especially a conversation that people want to have, I think that there has to be like a higher level of like how do we like interrogate arguments? And I think this all comes down a little bit to like, do we like add some guardrails around like how judge paradigms work a little bit as well? Of like, do we think that it's reasonable for people to like intervene at the highest level of like this is ridiculous? Like, surely like we like allow people that freedom, and maybe that should be like more accepted. And it probably takes a few people to be willing to do that at the highest level,
Mhm.
in order for there to be like a knock-on effect, right? So I don't think that happens overnight. For debaters, I actually think the answer is a little easier because I do think that there is strategic loss, and that there is some risk to that. But the thing that you get back, which is at a premium in PF, especially compared to other events, is these responses of like being like, hey, there's a margin to the argument are super time efficient. Because instead of like help like very, very like time intensive rebuttal to like breaking down the argument, you can just mitigate the scope of it by conceding parts of it and just being like, this is on the margin, and then showing why the margin of your argument is greater. So, what it actually allows you to do is you will get more time to prove your offense by saving time on defense by defending in this way, as opposed to trying to knock their one down to a zero, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I also feel like it makes it harder for them to knock your one down to a zero. You kind of actually like it's like a cheat code. Like if
Yeah.
you point this out, then your one can never be knocked down to a zero because you
Yeah.
reveal that like it actually has like a floor above zero.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
uh,
Now, like obviously, like I don't want the takeaway to be like make horribly delinked arguments that like never get beaten because you will lose some arguments like that. But yes, like assuming that your link chain is like well proven, you're guaranteed a level of impact, which is I think super
Yeah,
important.
well, so this is the thing is you joke about that, but that's what's happening in PF these days. It's like the natural conclusion of a debate environment in which every argument is a one or a zero is that you get the biggest impact. And then it doesn't matter if your links are awful, of course there's a chance it could be zero. Maybe it even like the unfortunate reality is a lot of these are honestly like starting at zero, if we're being real. And then they just think, oh, well, I'll just be a better debater at the end of the round. I'll just defend it better. They'll make this response, or they'll drop the argument more commonly. And then it suddenly becomes a one, and then I can go for it. But I think if debaters start pointing out that their arguments operate on the margins, this strategy starts to lose actually because you can point out either one, it becomes, it's just as easy to bring their argument down to a zero because it doesn't operate on the margin.
Yeah.
And two, it is easy to reveal that their argument is not a one as well, just because it's conceded. And so this is, I think, the easiest way to beat this kind of new meta of like ones and zeros and concessions of arguments. That obviously the easiest way to beat a team that is relying on you agreeing with them is to agree with them. Like I think if your
Yeah.
strategy, if you go in and you're like, fine, I will agree with these arguments, what next? Then you won't be caught off guard at all.
Yeah, and I will say, kind of going back to the strategy discussion we were having earlier, that's probably the second thing that I did so much more my last 2 years was I spent so much time on opposition my freshman and sophomore years of college, just like trying to beat arguments, like through the teeth of the argument, trying to beat the links, trying to beat the warrants, provide competing warrants. And then I realized I can 95% of the time concede the argument the other side's going for. Like I'm more than happy to do that. And then I can just explain why it doesn't matter. And I think that that's a strategy that people should be more willing to take, even in PF, where, and that way, like the other side, like I will say there is an optical argument to be made about if you openly concede an argument, it is way less persuasive when they get up there and they're like, they just drop the argument. It's like,
Yeah.
no, they conceded the argument. You are playing into their hands. And I think that you kind of give yourself the opportunity to be like, yeah, we are fine with what they said. But here's what matters way more. And the round becomes your round. I think that that's a strategy that works in any form of debate, and really, really is underutilized.
Dude, 100%. I don't know why people aren't doing this in PF. I think there's also like not even just an optical dimension, there's like a psychological dimension within the debate. Like you kind of get into their heads a little bit and you get into
Yeah.
your own head too. Like I think I've felt the most confident about rounds when I'm using the strategy and just being like, yeah, they're right. Like who cares? I'm still gonna win.
100%. Yeah, what in rounds that I'm just like I am happy to concede like the entire case. Like those are the rounds that I felt great about, right? Like you just like you were so confident because there's no uncertainty of like how your like rebuttal interacts with their argument. You were giving it to them, and you were just advancing independent offense that is beating that. Like it's also satisfying because in a sense, right, you took the all their work, you said that it was all fine, and that you are just using it to beat themselves. Like, and I don't know. I think there's something to be said for like efficiency. And I guess one thing I'm not familiar with in PF now is like what the speaks meta is, because I know that that like changes so much depending on both circuit and time and all that stuff. But if a PF debater was debating in front of me and was like conceding arguments and just being like, yep, like this doesn't matter, this matters way more. Like that's the kind of like eloquent speech that should get that 30, right? That's like what that should look like is you understand that you don't have to beat things by brute force. You can do it by just being compelling and convincing and understanding how things interact clearly.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like this works on like almost every judge. I don't know of any judge that I've ever talked to who would not reward this, very highly with good speaks because it just seems so dominant, from
Yeah,
any perspective,
totally.
like whatever you want to call it, a lay perspective or a tech perspective, like
Sure.
whatever it is. If you like you feel like a mastermind, like the
Yeah.
sitting back in your chair and you're like, all according to plan.
Yes, exactly. 100%. All the power goes to you. So,
Yeah, I think if anyone is watching this and you're like, I don't know, I kind of want to, still give responses to their argument. One, yeah, you could still give responses. I actually think this like supercharges your responses because it's like,
yeah.
if you're going in ready to say they're completely right about everything, then as soon as you get to something that is like so implausible that you're just like, well, this one's a bit of a stretch, we can give it to them, but also like are we being real? That doesn't make any sense at all. Then it's like perceptually, then it's like even stronger of a response, in my opinion. But also knowing you don't need it, that's like it makes you feel extra good. But two, if you're worried about this strategy and you think maybe there's a risk of you losing, of course there's a risk of you losing. There's always a risk of you losing. I think you should go try it. Like just give it a try in some practice rounds. Give it a try in like a local tournament. I promise, like, I think there's like a 90% chance that it makes you feel way more dominant in the round. And probably a very good chance that it makes it much more likely that you win, with regardless of the judging. I think that people draw too many distinctions between the type of judges with regard to this kind of strategy these days. Um,
Yeah. I think the last thing I'll say about the judging piece specifically, I think it's a really good point. Lay judges and tech judges, in my experience, in any form of debate, the number one thing they prioritize is cleanliness. So if it's clean, right? Like concession is the cleanest way that arguments can interact. If it is clean and you're still winning, that is what judges want to reward. And that's why I think it works, regardless of the type of judge you have.
100%. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna transition into one last maybe like strand of debate questions, and then we'll talk about some nuclear energy. Um,
Perfect. Sounds great.
I think the best question I have to ask you at the end of this is what are your biggest like debate hot takes? For example, overutilized, underutilized strategies, or just like anything that falls under the umbrella of a hot take.
Yeah, I think I have plenty, so I'll distill down to a couple, like I think one or two that are important. One is I I know that there's some pretty prominent people who've made this argument recently, and perhaps a way that I don't really like, but I do think that speed is like probably not good for debate generally. Um, and and I know that there's different people who've talked about this in different ways, but I think the most simple one is I think it's forcing people, especially young debaters, right? And high school debaters are the ones I'm really thinking of, to prioritize a volume of arguments over quality of arguments. And I just think that it makes the debate lower quality. And I understand this like desire to like fit as many things in so you give yourself options later on. I just don't really think that those options are good. And it might work, like it might work for some people in some cases. Like you're probably going to be able to like, I don't want to call it spreading necessarily, but like you can spread your opponents out like thin enough to where you can beat them. But the moment that you encounter someone who is more intelligent than you will lose, like immediately. And that's like kind of like a reality check that a lot of people won't get until the very highest level. And at that point, it's like hard to start developing that skill from scratch. And so if you really are like true to the activity in my mind, it's not that like speed is bad. I think speed is fine, right? Like as a judge, I'm fine tracking speed, but don't let speed be what you're aiming for and like a volume of arguments be what you're aiming for. Think about quality of arguments. Spend more time proving things. Um, and then I think go that way. I don't know if that's that hot of a take, but I know that speed has become so much more like ubiquitous
Yeah.
in PF, but also like Parley, for example. And I just think that it's kind of lowered the quality of the activity
It's an
generally.
interesting take. I will say for me, it's not a hot take. I think I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
And actually, almost every single person I've interviewed, and I just interviewed like the LDTOC champion who's known for like tricks. I interviewed like a bunch of policy people. All of them agree actually that speed is not good, which is interesting to hear from all of these people who
Yeah.
have recently exited those activities. But it is increasingly a hot take among current PFers.
Yeah.
You said you don't want to
Yeah.
call it spreading. I will go ahead and call it spreading for you. Unfortunately, we are there. Like the round I just
Okay.
watched on the YouTube before
Yeah.
this, 100% was spreading. Like double breaths and everying.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
I do think it's
Once
quite
the double
unfortunate.
breath, that's how you know you're beyond the pale. So
Yeah, 100%.
yeah.
Yeah, RIP to
I'll give
terrible skills.
one, yeah, I'll give one more hot take that's kind of similar. I think that debate, and this was kind of the beginning of our conversation, but I think that we are overstructuring, especially PF, but I think generally debate is falling into this trap of like overstructuring. And what I mean by that is like I don't think that we should be running arguments that are like card cutting itself is fine. I think it's like a useful activity, but like the idea that cases should just be like compilations of cards, or like a series of pre-written like this ads and I guess the more techie cases like K's, right? Like I don't know that that is great. Like I don't understand why we have to do that. Like the whole point of public forum, like when the format was created, was like this is an activity that you are able to convince the average person of like a certain point of view. And I just like cackle thinking of like PF debaters on the street, like reading off like 40 cards to try to convince like some random person at a cafe that like, I don't know, in this case, like nuclear energy is great, right? Like there's ways to have that conversation. I think there has to be a change in the meta. And whether that's like top down or just driven by participants, I'm definitely not the person to answer. But I think that that would be good for the activity. And one possible solution of this is to bring back judges beyond first year outs. And I know this is the problem with every single circuit, whether it's high school, college, Parley, PF, whatever it might be. I think it's just about keeping people engaged because as much as tech may make the activity seem quote unquote better for people who are in it, all the people who come back are less like excited to come judge the activity and continue to engage the more that that happens because the more separation that you get, you realize that like that isn't how the real world works. and it makes it difficult for people to want to invest their time in something like that when they're seeing constantly that, it's really just not replicable or like realistic.
Yeah, there's like a Plato quote. It's like I feel like we are so many levels removed from reality. We're like it's like forms of forms or whatever, like reflections of reflections of reflections. Like the game that we're playing in PF right now is like heuristics of the real world,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah,
And we're
that's
treating
exactly
those
right.
like we're treating those as the truth. And then if you go back to the real world, like, nah, that's not how debate works anymore. That's like totally different. Which yeah, I think is a bit of a problem. It's a problem for retention of like the older people. But it's also a problem for I think a lot of the like educational benefits of the activity. And more than that, like honestly, I don't really care about the educational benefits of the activity. It's a problem for the fun of the activity, in my
I
opinion.
agree for sure.
It's just a less interesting game when you are only like treating these. It's just a bunch of like chess pieces at this point without the weight behind it. We're not inhabiting our speeches and like really believing them anymore. And I think that's
Yeah,
what I think is so like that's what makes me feel alive when I debate, not like,
yeah,
aha, you have conceded my link.
yeah, 100%.
Um, yeah, I think it's a shame. The hot take I think I would translate it into is also like paraphrasing is good. Gosh, I think debate took a wrong turn when we stopped paraphrasing as much.
100%. Go back to paraphrasing. Can't agree more.
Okay, I we have about 20 minutes left, which is perfect. So it's time for me to grill you a bit on nuclear energy. So the April topic for PF is resolved. The US federal government should substantially increase its investment in domestic nuclear energy. What are your first impressions of the topic, and how would you start preparing?
Yeah. Um, so this is something that I personally definitely have like a connection to because both my parents work in energy.
Oh,
So it's definitely like something that I grew up around and have thought a lot about. I think the number one thing, and we alluded to this earlier, is just understanding what the trade-offs are. And it doesn't mean you have to like start with like figuring out like what is going to be most probable yet. I think just understanding how does energy work is by far the most important thing. Because like energy is not like you make it in a plant and then it like poof exists. There's a lot of different pieces to like how like energy gets produced and then stored and then transmitted and then the risks with each of those parts of the process. And I think if I were to prep this topic or like coach a team prepping this topic, the first couple of days of your prep should be site agnostic prep. Like it should just be learning about nuclear energy. Like how does it work? What are the important pieces in the process? And then interrogating each of those pieces and collecting information, right? So like that would be kind of my initial approach. And then I think, starting with, pro-nuclear side, I think that initially the things that stand out, obviously there's like climate impact, right? I think that that's a huge part of it. I think that there's also like, you know, there's a lot to be said about how there's just more efficient utilization of energy. And I think the climate impact is actually multifold, right? So there's obviously the like you reduce emissions from other types of energy generation, but it's also like by far the most like effective use of land. And I think that there's like a lot of impacts of that, right? Given what we're seeing with like real estate markets generally speaking, like if you move away from the need for that much commercial land, you open up a whole host of possibilities. And I think that that's something that has to be explored a little bit more in depth, but that's kind of like, the general thrust of the that side is like, you create this avenue for more nuclear energy. And the other thing that I think is really important is that the US, when it comes to energy generation, is definitely someone that other parts of the world look to.
hmm
Um, and I think that that's also really, really important. So if the US is able to do this sustainably, it means that the blueprint for other countries to start to do it also exists. And I think that that's also very, very good. The last piece, which is honestly interesting, and I'd have to think about how it would play into the current meta of P PF. But there's this entire idea that nuclear energy is probably the fastest way for the US to become energy independent. Um, and it's unclear whether it would be like super clean as an argument for nuclear energy, like whether US energy independence is actually great. Because there's tons of arguments as to why the US being reliant on other countries creates more like interconnection, especially in the current like political climate. So I think that there's like kind of an argument for both sides there in terms of like the US having a separate energy market versus like a very contingent one, I think is like another area to explore for sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't even think that hard about like the energy independence might be a bad thing argument. I think that's actually got some teeth to it. Like apart from the basic just like economic interdependentness or interconnectedness or whatever, like I guess fosters peace in some sense. It increases
Yeah, yeah,
mutually assured destruction. I watched a lecture at Brown in my senior year that was like one of these climate talks that they did. And there was this guy who was talking about like the benefits of energy independence from China vis-a-vis like clean energy. It wasn't nuclear specific, but it was like more about renewables. And one of the arguments against like decoupling from China was that you actually get like crazy gains when you specialize a little bit in the international energy market. I guess this is just like the basic argument for trade as well, right? Just like applied
sure,
to
sure,
clean
but
energy.
yeah,
Like it might be more efficient if we focus on our like relative advantages, comparative advantages, I guess, of like maybe doing more of the research and development and then exporting our ideas abroad, and like having more of an internationalized supply chain that ends up being more efficient for the global supply of nuclear energy, um, or of energy in general. But yeah, I don't know. Definitely an interesting argument to think about. Um, what are your ideas for the other side, for the con?
yeah. So there's I have a lot of mixed thoughts about the other side because there's a lot of arguments that kind of stick out as like PF likely arguments, which I'm not really a huge fan of. So I'll give an example. Like I think the most obvious one is like just risk, right? Like if the US is like more nuclear dependent, there's more uranium that is out there, it gets into the wrong hands and people will make nuclear weapons. Like first of all, no, that is not how this works. Like you cannot just take uranium from a reactor. Also, like the levels of enrichment are very different for power generation and like weaponry, right? So there's just a lot of nuance there. So I just want to caution against making those arguments flippantly. I think the biggest thing and the biggest argument that I would run, and I might run a single argument case on this side, is that it is politically destabilizing for the US to actually invest in nuclear energy. I might be a big like nuclear energy person. Like I very, very pro nuclear energy. I think that there are like risks about like, plant accidents or like Fukushima like was a very real thing. But I think that those risks are so highly mitigated given the level of like nuclear plant regulation in the US that I'm not that worried about it. I think the biggest argument is the political destabilization argument. And I think there's a lot of work that has to be done here. The first is that coal is currently like one of the largest drivers of energy in the US. But coal is also one of the most entrenched industries in the states that it operates in, right? So you're thinking like Pennsylvania and West Virginia, for example. Um, those states are already super critical for Democrats to start like working their way back from 2024, right? Like that is where Democrats felt out of touch with individual people. That is where, a lot of the messaging fell flat. And I think that this move would alienate those people to such an extreme degree that it would make it so difficult to win in 2026 and 2028. And I think that the impacts of these arguments are really just if you do something that is so politically devastating for the Democratic Party, and I think you probably have to do some work to prove like why Democratic Party policies are generally good, but I feel like in the general ether of like debate, it's probably not that high burden of an argument.
Yeah.
But I think if that's kind of like the line you pursue, there's very, very strong reasons to believe that like this creates a road back that is so much more treacherous and means that you are unable to do things like protect like fundamental rights for people, potentially do things like bring back US aid, which has been like something that people have talked about as like, a mission for 26 and 28 is like revitalizing some of those government agencies that are doing such important work. Bringing back funding for important initiatives and making that like the most important thing in the round, which I know is kind of like a little bit of an orthogonal strategy to like the motion in and of itself. But I think that it's like the most compelling argument and the best argument against nuclear energy. To be fair, I think you should run like some of the nuclear harms arguments as like there is like some level of waste that is produced, and companies are going to look to like dispose of waste in like the lowest cost ways possible. And even if there aren't going to be like large scale disasters, there will be instances of things like leakage, for example, that will pollute waterways that people are reliant on. And I think that that will have impacts on industry as well. But I think that the political argument on like destabilizing democratic bases or like blue collar workers in the Rust Belt is for me like massive. And I think that this also has impacts on states where there's like a fair amount of fracking, for example, stuff like that, that you really alienate those people. Um, I think that there's some responses to this argument about like retraining, but I think that those are tough to make. Like I don't think they're like quite like as easy as just saying you can retrain these people.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is exactly like why you're here, is to make arguments like this. I actually have not heard this argument made by anyone else, so I really want to investigate it with you. There are like three quick things I want to ask. One is, I guess this first one is not a question, just like you make a very good point. One of the most eye-opening things that I learned when I like took some classes about climate change, was like, I thought I knew everything about climate. I was like number one climate change debater. No, not at all. Like fossil fuels, coal plants are so entrenched in these communities. Like I feel like it's easy to think, oh, these stupid Republicans voting against or like not supporting renewable policies that will help our climate or help like save air pollution, stop it. But I think that once you start to realize that like their, school is funded by the oil company. Their roads are built by the oil company. Their community centers built by the like everyone is employed by the oil company in their neighborhood. Like it starts to become like, okay, I understand a little bit why this is actually a bit of a difficult problem. We can't just like take away the oil company. Because lots and lots of people's livelihoods and like services and stuff go with it. So I think this is an argument that people maybe aren't expecting very much, but seems like it does have a lot to it. The two questions I have, one question is, I guess this is maybe the biggest problem I see with the argument. How do we know that it's Democrats that are doing this? Like, why can't you run this
Yeah.
on the other side and be like, yeah, if Trump does this, it's gonna like screw him over because of the same reasoning.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And that's probably the biggest thing that probably needs to be thought about with the argument. I think the reason that it's even if it is Republicans doing it, it will get painted as the Democrats' fault is because it's seen as a pro climate change policy, which the Republican platform has like just disavowed, right? So even, and this is, part of, we can talk about how PF motions are written and like resolutions come through, but like obviously Donald Trump is not going to subsidize nuclear energy in these states. Like he would not do it, at least not like this, and not like just like a massive national, like one, federal government subsidizing anything right now seems extremely unlikely. But secondly, like you're going to subsidize things that undercut the industries in the areas that won you the election. Like plausibility is just like a little bit out there. So I think that doing a little bit of that framing is important. I actually don't know how receptive like the PF meta is to that right now. But if we were to get nuclear subsidies, I would imagine that it is spearheaded by Democrats in
Yeah,
Congress.
that makes sense. I guess to translate a little into like the current PF technical terms, I feel like there's a bit of a topicality argument with the word substantial in the resolution here. Like Trump does and could support some level of nuclear energy. For example, like he loves the idea of co-locating tiny nuclear reactors with like the AI data centers and like helping out Google and Amazon and all of them. But maybe that is not like a substantial increase in investments in nuclear energy or enough to cross the threshold where it meets like what the resolution is presumably talking about. And so then we step one step further into territory that Trump would never touch. And as a result, the most likely interpretation of the topic is that this is something spearheaded by the Democrats. Is that like an accurate way to say?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's super fair.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I think that, it's a little bit delicate link work, as Ryan
Yeah.
Lafferty said.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
certainly, I think plausible. I think that this is an argument that definitely could win. And I think one of the strengths of the argument is it molds really well with this argument that I've been toying with on the neg, which is I think there's a way to capture a lot of the AF uniqueness, like a lot of the AF arguments using uniqueness, and say like, listen, we should just allow the nuclear energy sector to grow naturally without government intervention. Because your argument is not necessarily that nuclear energy is bad. It's like the specific government investment or the government substantial subsidization of the nuclear sector. That is what creates the political catastrophe for Democrats. And so you could plausibly say, like, actually, we get very good nuclear energy as well. Maybe we get like almost the same benefits that you do because the private
Yeah.
sector is probably much greater than the whatever the government can do vis-a-vis nuclear energy.
What
Um,
is the current like PF attitude towards like counter plans? Is it still like pretty anti or like
well, okay, this is a very interesting question. Because I've been doing a little bit of work recently agitating for this use of, there's a term in the rules called a general practical solution, which is effectively a counterplan that is explicitly allowed. But yeah, the general vibe is still no, because the rules, to be fair, do say explicitly no counterplans.
yeah? Because my thought is like if like Meg concedes that nuclear energy is good, is it like plausible for them to say that they would defend like general deregulation that is not like not financially endorsing, so like maybe making it easier for nuclear plants to get land contracts in certain areas, for example, which I think is like, again, like kind of what you said, right? Let the private sector do it, the government can clear the way, but it then becomes you get all the benefits of nuclear energy without political blowback.
Right. Yeah, I think this is great. I mean, the answer to your question, can the neg do this, is a complicated one. The answer is yes, if they prove that this is likely to happen in the status quo trajectory, which is actually not so far-fetched based on the
Yeah,
reading that I've done. But in order to like choose to do that and really fiat it, the answer is much more complicated. I guess technically my view is like if it seems general and practical enough as a solution, then maybe it's not technically a counterplan, but this is a bit controversial.
yeah. I would say that like gutting the EPA does feel like deregulating nuclear like
Yeah, right.
power in some ways. So I don't know. Have to think about that one a little bit more. But
Yeah, but even without the government doing really anything,
yeah,
market side or like subsidization, whatever, I think there is a pretty like there seems to be fairly strong and fairly recent evidence that the nuclear sector is doing pretty well. It's like it's got a lot of corporate support right now. It has bipartisan support, which at the very least means it's not being like shot down, which has happened in the past. It's not like being overburdened by crazy stringent regulations, and so it seems to have the path set up for it to grow quite rapidly going into the future without subsidization.
for
So I
sure.
think
I agree.
there's like a whole host of arguments that you can read with this uniqueness. There are some that become complicated. Like you have to be more careful with arguments like nuclear waste is bad because you stand the risk of like non-uniquing a lot of that and symmetricizing it. But I think the argument you're describing is another one that I think fits squarely in the category of like sort of synergizing quite well with this narrative of like just let the market do it, keep the government out of it. One of the consequences of government intervention is that you like screw over any chance of a blue wave in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, we are about at 10:40, so I guess last question for you. Do you have any last thoughts to leave us with, either about nuclear energy or about debate? Any wisdom you can dispense?
Yeah, I think that the closer arguments get to the real world, the more like rewarding the activity will become. And as you continue to stick with the activity, it retains its meaningfulness to you in a way that's really powerful. Um, and speaking kind of like on behalf of a lot of people who've, watched the activity evolve at various levels, but over a period of time, I think that's what makes it interesting. I judge a fair bit of Parley still, both BP and American Parley. And the rounds that I think are like the best, highest quality rounds and the best representation of debate are the ones where people try to be charitable and realistic, and comparative in the way that they speak about things. And so I think that to get the most out of the activity, that is like the biggest need for people. And I'm really excited to see like the activity continue to do that, and hope that that can permeate back down to like the high school level as well.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I will try my best to convince people to spread the good,
Yeah,
you know.
of
Uh,
course. And, I appreciate all that you do, Mac. I know that you are a big champion of this in debate at all levels, so I appreciate it. And I think this conversation is great. I really enjoyed it.
yeah, thanks so much for being on. Appreciate you, using a lot of your very valuable time to come talk with some younger kids about the good old days of PF.
Exactly right. Yeah. No, I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks so much. I will
Yeah.
see you later. Bye bye.
Talk to you later.